Welcome to the Science of Relevancy. This is your host, Rex Allen, and today we're continuing our ongoing conversation about being relevant. The entire purpose of this show, and when we do this on cross media here, is to talk about the entire science of gaining and remaining relevant. So many people, brands, companies, they struggle with this concept to stay relevant, and it creates this constant innovation that they must be doing. And the interesting part is we have technology innovation that is happening faster than ever. So it's really an art of a science to stay relevant in the face of all this technology. Well, sometimes to look forward, you have to look back. And today I'm going to talk about great example of relevancy that comes to us from the turn of the century, back in the days of Henry Ford and the Model T. Now, it's a really interesting study in relevancy because at the time there were hundreds of automobile manufacturers, and innovation was coming along at a rapid pace. In the city of Detroit, there were over 130 different automobile manufacturers that were making automobiles. The automobile was actually invented over in Germany, and it was in 1886 by Benz, which ended up being the Mercedes-Benz Corporation. So by the time the Model T came about, it was actually 1908. So it was getting close to a decade and a half, almost 2 decades, that the automobile had been in existence. So when you take a look at this story and how it remained relevant, Henry Ford was really a visionary. He had a lot of great ideas and he understood a really big picture. And I've studied him a lot because he's somebody that was involved in a huge innovation that changed the lives of the world forever. Now, what he did on the first aspect is he wanted to get his cars out so they could be affordable to just about anybody. And he really targeted the middle class of the United States. Now, to do this, he knew that he had a pretty good sized marketplace. In 1910, the US population was right at 92 million, a little over 92 million people. So it was a big market. And the problem with the automobile industry was each car was handcrafted up until the assembly line came along. So each car was basically assembled by a team from ground up. And it really was an inefficient model because you really couldn't create enough fast for them. Now, there's a misconception in history that everyone acclaims that Henry Ford was the father of the assembly line. Well, that's not true. The assembly line was actually created by Ransom Olds, which was the Oldsmobile manufacturing company, the car company Oldsmobile. But Henry Ford looked at this and he actually really perfected it. So he's not the guy who invented the innovation of the assembly line, but he perfected it. Because of his innovation on the assembly line, he created cars with interchangeable parts. So each car in mass production could be assembled, and if there's issues, you just grab another one and put it right there. So this really created the combination between the assembly line and interchangeable parts. They could truly mass produce vehicles. And it wasn't long before they were making a couple hundred cars a day. And in the height of the production of the Model T, they were actually building over 2,000 cars a day. So the car sold from October 1st, 1908 until 1927. So 19 years it was a model. And it's really interesting because if you look at the all-time best-selling automobiles, the Model T ranks 8th in all of history. However, that's a little bit of a misleading statistic because if you look at the population in the marketplace at the time, he sold over 16.5 million of these vehicles when the United States population grew to about 95 million people by 1927. The Model A held the #1 selling of all time vehicles for 45 years past 1927. So it was in 1972 before another model of car overtook those sales numbers. And that ended up being the Toyota Corolla, which, let's put some perspective to this. The Toyota Corolla was outsold the Ford Model T when there were 210 million people in the United States. So it's a completely different marketplace. So you have to really put it in perspective. The Model T was huge, and to remain number one for 45 years. Another thing that Ford did was he basically set up financing. He had made enough money that he was able to bring installment plans for the sale of the Model T. And this really opened up the marketplace. So now, just a common person, the banker, the guy that works at the factory, the farmer, the guy that works at the local gas station, and there were gas stations back then, families that own small businesses, they could afford a vehicle because they were making installment plans. So at the time, it was a perfect vehicle. It was relevant. It was new transportation. It had huge impacts. So Ford, you just cranked these babies out. Now, another kind of funny thing is they came, if you wanted a Model T, you could get it in any color you want as long as it was black. So he made things very simple and it was very straightforward. Now let's talk about some of the innovations. It was really an earth-changing and life-changing situation with the Model Ts coming out. They had orders sometimes at 10,000 a day. It was really aimed at the middle class, and it made transportation available to millions. Now, I have a story in my life. My grandmother on my maternal side, she lived on a ranch out in the Sandhills, Nebraska, and she didn't go to town for 8 years. So for 8 years, she was out on the farm. So when the Model T came out, there were millions and millions of people because the United States was still at this time heavily, um, farm-based, agricultural-based world economy. So many people lived out in rural areas, and so now with this type of transportation, it changed the lives of many, and to able to get into town to run errands, just it changed everything. An additional thing, which is really not documented very well, is many farmers grabbed these vehicles and started to use them for other tasks. They were like the lightweight tractor. So the Model T was very rugged, had a great engine. Even though the engine was only a 20 horsepower engine, it still allowed the farmer to pull sleds and do little things around, and things that he wouldn't have a bigger tractor to do, but could just be an additional piece of equipment. So it was really innovative there. And then it started to change American culture on the whole. A lot of it had to do with social interaction and the ability to finally get to places quickly. Prior to the automobile, you could travel for weeks to get some places, and now that was moved to hours or minutes. The whole concept of going for a road trip, just going out in kind of a leisure environment where people could, for the first time, just go and get in the car and go nowhere in particular. And that was not something that was readily available. I mean, if you had a horse or a buggy or a wagon, it was a lot of effort to be able to saddle up the horses and get everything going. So the automobile changed leisure, it changed social, and here's one that's even kind of funny. It impacted sex. So there were lots of couples who could then sneak away and have a tryst in their vehicle and, basically enjoy each other away from others in a vehicle. So the impact of the Model T was huge. It really changed everything from business, transportation, social interaction, clear down to all the way down to love and sex. So it had this huge, huge impact in the world. And it wasn't just the United States, the Model Ts were sent all over the world. Well, Ford had built this empire, and at the time, he had over $1 billion. So his money at that time would equate to about 100 billion. I mean, it was just an enormous fortune. But like many innovators and big thinkers, he was rather eclectic, and he had a vision of what would happen with transportation. But what took place is he started to get disfranchised and disenchanted with what he had created. He grew up in an agrarian culture. He spent time on the farm, and he started to see the impacts of the automobile, and it was getting a little bit crazy. So he just didn't like the impact that his innovation was building. But he was really a stubborn guy, and he fell into a syndrome that I talk about all the time today from technology companies, and Ford is a technology company. Is Ford was really in what I call the market leader complacency syndrome. Um, and in market leader complacency, it's been proven in high tech, and you see this all the time with all kinds of industries. Whoever is the company that's leading the marketplace at one level of innovation or one level of technology generally is not the leader in the next round or the next innovation. So we see this time and time again, and it's really prevalent today in high tech. A lot of software companies in and out of business in less than 10 years, and multi-billion dollar organizations. And I can name tons and tons of them. You look at companies like Tandem, HP Big Computers, the Sun Microsystems, their Oracle's buying up of storage tech and Sun. There's just a ton of examples like this. So what happens in this market leader complacency syndrome is the companies get fat and they get a little lazy, and they're basically living on their own vapors because of the revenue that's created, and they're just enjoying all this success. Well, if you look back into 1920, about 1925, uh, Henry Ford was doing that. He was a market leader complacency. He was stubborn. He thought that the Model T was everything anybody needed. He'd rolled 15 million of them off the line, and he didn't see that there was a need for a change in innovation for the relevancy. So what happened is General Motors and Oldsmobile and others, Pontiac at the time, came out with new models. And one of the biggest things, which was a little bit funny, is they had different colors. So for the first time, you could buy a vehicle that was blue or green or silver. It just wasn't the Henry Ford Black. And so what was taking place is that these innovators, these competitors, were bringing out different models, sedans, and the first pickups and stuff. And Ford started to lose market share. Well, he had executives at the company. And in fact, his son Edison's brother-in-law was an executive at the time, and he wrote a letter to Ford about the need for bringing out new models. And Ford had dug his heels in. He and Edison, his son, was adamant about these changes, but Ford just was complacent in this with his market leadership. And push came to shove, and a lot of and it's interesting, largest commercial entity at the time, it's still a family business. And so Edison and Henry Ford fought over the need for new models. And so finally, in 1928, they introduced the Model A. And it's odd because you think the Model T, because he had been going alphabetically, it would have been the Model U. But he thought because they were bringing forth these new innovations that they wanted to start over at Model A. So this is a great example how you have a company and they almost lost their market share. They almost went out of business. Well, not quite out of business, but they almost lost their position in the marketplace because they weren't staying relevant. People wanted different colors, different ones, different styles. So luckily, Ford Motor Company created these new models. And between General Motors and Ford, that started in 1928, the trend of the new models every year. So if you look at the automotive technology industry, and it is a technology industry, you've got a situation where Even though this is a very old technology with cars and automobiles, they have learned how to stay relevant. And they stay relevant by bringing new innovations to the marketplace with the new models each year. So, in order to look forward, we look backward. In this topsy crazy world, we see these types of companies that are going in and out of business on a quick basis, leaders in innovation. But you really go back to a world where innovation and relevancy is it's timeless. So think that through as you're starting to look at your business, your brand, your personal brand, and how you deal with the marketplace. Take a look at human behavior and the science of being relevant. It doesn't go away. So, in additional episodes, we're going to talk about other innovations and technology innovations. Some of them going in and out very fast, some of them timeless, some of them huge impact on the world. But again, my whole focus here at the Science of Relevancy and our team is to help you continuously think and change so you have a mindset of innovation and how to be relevant. So until next time, work hard, think big, and stay relevant.